Hi, everyone. Vitalik, thanks for joining us. Let's jump into it. On Twitter beforehand, I put it out to the Twitterverse, what questions to ask Vitalik, and one I liked was this one. It's year 2025, 5 years from now. What is the killer app on Ethereum?
It's difficult to predict, Like, I remember in 2015, the kinds of things I was predicting back then was kind of thinking about. And some of the things that we've seen, like decentralized financial systems, like stablecoins, DAOs, and ENS, and all of these different applications. And it does feel like those things are kind of starting to come now, and a lot of the stuff that's actually happening now is kind of the same sorts of things that we did end up seeing in 2015. Though at the same time, we've also seen a lot of other things that I was not really expecting. And a lot of the other kind of non-financial applications around just using blockchains for just like things like tickets, certificates, and kind of proof of like being at a particular place or doing a particular thing, and all of these other kind of little fun applications. It's just one example. And 5 years from now, and I guess I could see it being a lot of the kind of same things that we see today still being there, but just hopefully being better and kind of bigger and more mature and kind of fewer risks and better usability and all of these things. Though at the same time, I think we'll also see a lot of surprises that I just don't know about, and I'm looking forward to them.
You mentioned DeFi. Let's stick with that for a bit, because that's sort of quite hot in this world, but I know still for the mainstream financial industry, they're like, what's that? And someone told me today they estimate maybe 50,000 users in DeFi platforms. So take us in the next year or two on that. Is that going to mushroom, or do you think it's viable to catch on?
And I think the DeFi applications that are going to see the most users are the simplest ones. Like if you're holding DAI, or like actually no one should hold DAI. Everyone who's holding DAI should hold Chai instead, because it comes with the interest rate, and it's still inside of the same platform. But like if you're then it feels like you're holding a token, and it barely feels like you're using an application, but you are using an application, and lots of people are using like DAI for different kinds of things. So I expect in the future as well, and the applications that have the most users also to just keep being the simple ones. So stable coins, other kinds of synthetic assets, decentralized exchanges, a lot of kind of similar things to what we have today. Though there's things like I don't think there's anything that kind of completely doesn't exist today that I hope starts existing. I think the thing that I hope for is just things that are similar to things that exist, but that try to kind of reduce a lot of the kind of complexity and the centralization that we see right now. Like there's concerns that some people have raised around like maker governance and like how much MKR you need to kind of take over that mechanism. For example, there's concerns around just like relying on kind of 3 smart contract platforms one after the other, and are you kind of tripling your smart contract risk? There's concerns about like, do any of these decentralized oracles actually work? And I definitely hope that we see more improvements in kind of that kind of risk minimization. I don't know. If privacy is part of DeFi, then I would also hope for more improvements in privacy as well. If smart contract wallets are part of DeFi, I hope to see more smart contract wallets too.
In December, you laid out a pretty ambitious timeline for ETH2. We're going to see Beacon later this year, I believe you predicted, and then next year we could see ETH1 swept into ETH2. Do you still stick to that? Do you think that's realistic?
And I definitely think that the ETH2 has been kind of proceeding quite kind of quickly and regularly the last few months. So the next milestone that we're going to see right now is probably when we get to a kind of stable multi-client testnet with just a substantial number of people participating in it. And over the last few months, we've been seeing a lot of kind of long-running single-client testnets. We've been seeing those clients just do a huge amount of optimization work, like increase their efficiency and kind of reduce their overhead by a factor of like more than 100. I feel like we're weeks away from that. And then when we're there, then like it's theoretically launchable. It's just a matter of like how long we want to run it in order to reduce the chance of security risks. And so, like, once you have like test nets, then it is kind of de-risked in subsets, right? Because you don't really have any, like, it's just obvious that there aren't more fundamental barriers. It's just a matter of just making sure all of the bugs are fixed. And yeah, and I'm optimistic. Now then, obviously, after proof of stake, we have sharding, and then sharding, like, that's less tested, and it's the sort of thing that kind of no blockchain has really gone before. Like, you don't really have yet kind of large-scale blockchain networks that don't have kind of single nodes that have all of the data. And it's been kind of solved on a kind of theoretical level, but it obviously needs to be solved on a practical level. I mean, we're hoping for next year, but we'll see. But I mean, at the same time, also, we have been seeing other scaling solutions emerge other than the whole ETH2 direction. And I specifically mean rollups, right? And like over the last 6 months, we've seen this big move from Plasma and kind of thinking about these kind of pure layer 2s to kind of largely thinking more about these kind of hybrid layer 2s where you do computation off-chain, but you keep the data on-chain. And it turns out that with that combination, it's just much, much easier to build these scaling solutions that just scale the EVM as it exists. So it lets you just take any existing application and just like run it inside of a rollup. You don't have to design your application in a different way just so it can scale. And I mean, I think that's gonna put relieve a lot of pressure in the short term as well. And like just to give like some statistics, like the numbers say that if everyone switched to rollups, then the transactions per second on the Ethereum chain could increase to about 2,500, which is like a factor of 100 increase from today, right? And so if that happens, then I mean, I hope that ETH2 takes gets released safely, quickly, and expeditiously. But if it ends up taking even something crazy like 5 years, then I think just rollups alone are still going to give us enough leeway to survive until we have sharding.
Yeah, and watching Ethereum for a few years, this has seemed to be the story a little bit. Theoretically, you're there, but operationally, it always seems to take a lot more steps. And a couple of people today sort of suggested, on the governance question, do we need more transparency? Does this foundation need to do more to signal where it's going and to sort of, maintain trust in what it's doing? What's your latest thoughts on governance?
I mean, on that side, like, I don't know, like, there's a lot of people calling for transparency, but like, it's less clear transparency of what specific things. Like, the client development teams are pushing out like blog posts with updates every 1 to 2 weeks, and there's core developer calls that are kind of open and public happening every couple of weeks. There's blog posts from the Ethereum Foundation happening every couple of weeks. So if you're actively following it, I think the information on kind of where ETH2 is going and where the latest progress is there. I mean, things like how the foundation kind of internally decides like how certain kinds of grants are allocated yet. I mean, I'll admit that part of things is still more opaque at this point. But even there, like I feel like there's a lot of information that's kind of very public if you know where to look.
And this one might be a bit of a perennial question too, but I think Ethereum has flourished in part because it's got a leader, you. Whereas Bitcoin, has, I think, had more fractious and fights because in the absence of that. So could Ethereum, do you think, survive on its own without you right now?
I think on a technological level, it's definitely gotten to the point where it absolutely can. Like, I mean, Danny Ryan, one of our lead kind of researchers and devs, has proven extremely capable of kind of coordinating the work happening between the ETH2 development teams. And the ETH2 development teams themselves have proven like very capable of operating autonomously. And in research, there's that used to be like 2 people 2 years ago, but now there's this fairly substantial team, people like Justin, like Dankred, a couple of others that have been actively pushing forward on that. I mean, 1.x is autonomous, privacy work is autonomous. So from a technical point of view, I really feel like it's just should be obvious that nothing kind of depends on myself. But I mean, there's also the social question of like, if I disappear, like, would there be kind of different people kind of trying to kind of push their own agendas harder and kind of fight each other harder? And I mean, it's possible, but at the same time, I also feel like I've tried to kind of let the community resolve things by itself, like on a couple of occasions. Like I've definitely sat out of completely of a bunch of the more contentious debates. Like I've sat out completely of the most recent issuance reduction in Byzantium from 3 to 2, and that kind of just passed on its own reasonably well. The multi-sig kind of like wallet unlocking debate, I've barely and. I didn't really say much, and like there were arguments, there was contention, there was a carbon vote, and it kind of resolved itself in the no direction pretty clearly, I feel. So I think there's definitely evidence that kind of the community is capable of coordinating these things, and that the community kind of does have these sort of antibodies against people trying to make proposals that are kind of really hostile.
I had another interesting question today. It's staying on the topic of Vitalik. You launched Ethereum, I guess it was 4 or 5 years ago now or more. How are you different from when you launched it?
In many ways. I think the biggest kind of challenge that I had at the beginning, and I've talked about this many times, is just kind of understanding people and understanding of the limitations of people. Like, back in 2014, I did kind of end up kind of hit hard quite a bit because, there was this kind of initial founding team, and I kind of expected everyone to just kind of work together for the common good and just kind of be nice to each other. And in a lot of ways that ended up not happening, and there were a lot of these different kind of interests pushing for kind of influence and money and all of these other things. And that's something that I feel like I have a much better handle on than I did 5 years ago. Otherwise, my understanding of a lot of technical questions, definitely. My understanding of a lot of kind of half technical, half social questions, like even just topics like governance, for example. Like governance is the ultimate kind of question that's in the middle of those two areas, because you can model it mathematically, you can model it psychologically, and you can model it in ways that kind of combine elements of both, and like both sides of that are something that I didn't really understand well, and now I've kind of gone through a lot of different possibilities, kind of looked through a lot of different directions, and I feel like both myself but also the whole space just kind of understands what the different options there are, and kind of what the different trade-offs are, and like what are the directions that we could still improve.
Interesting. I'd like to kind of look at the broader decentralized space or the other chains emerging, and just to mix it up a bit, I'll give you a name and just give me a kind of a one-word answer or a one-sentence answer what you think of it. So let's start with Cosmos.
Interesting. The Cosmos kind of pitch that you hear is kind of interoperability between blockchains, which it's interesting, and I'm definitely kind of very happy that they're kind of proceeding and they're doing all of that work on making it happen. The main risk that I would see for them is just the possibility that interoperability can happen without Cosmos.
Tezos.
Definitely one of the projects that I have kind of respect for, because like it has a community that actually kind of has values and has a philosophy that it's trying to put forward. Like it's not just a coin that's like there to just be a coin and just try to kind of make money for people. And a lot of the values there, in many cases, I disagree with. Like I disagree with their approach to on-chain governance. I've criticized and certain other things, but just the fact that it is a project that seems to kind of have a concrete philosophy of what it's trying to accomplish and seems to be earnestly just doing that is, I think, like a positive mark for it.
Polkadot.
I don't know. It's kind of in this weird kind of middle point between being kind of Cosmos-like and kind of being a smart contract chain. We'll see.
Just a couple more, I promise. Dfinity.
Great. The great was in I think like Dominic does a lot of and the team, and they've done a lot of good work around BLS, and they've done a lot of good work around just kind of researching and trying to do new consensus algorithms and trying to kind of capture this kind of niche of at least as I interpret it, kind of more high performance, but a little bit less decentralized. I mean, we'll see.
Any other projects out there you want to talk favorably or against?
I don't know. I mean, I like criticizing categories because then each individual project can kind of feel plausible deniability because they can pretend that they're the good guys in the category. So, like, I'm critical of of VC chains, and I think VC chains are generally lame, but like, not your VC chain.
Well played. I'd like to shift again to the broader world of macroeconomics and geopolitics. Last year, I think, was quite interesting with Facebook's Libra, and then China. You can see American interest in Facebook trying to say, okay, America, you have to do this because the Chinese will do it first and use their new digital currency.
Yeah, the Chinese were doing it because Americans were doing it first.
Right. But so how's this take us in the future? I mean, can central banks put this back in the bottle, or will they be able to sort of exert foreign policy pressure with currencies like Libra or the Chinese version of it?
And I definitely, I think these kinds of things are going to happen, and I think a lot of nation states are going to try pushing out their own currency in different forms. But I think the equilibrium of it is definitely one that's kind of relatively favorable to things I care about, which is basically just like not having like kind of super powerful global choke points of failure, kind of controlling large chunks of the world or the entire world. And the reason is that like if you have multiple options to choose from, then that kind of puts competitive pressure on them. And also just if the more these platforms become digital, like it's hard to make a platform that's digital without making it cryptographically provable. And when you can cryptographically prove transactions, you can make a decentralized exchange because you can make a smart contract on Ethereum that says, if you give me one like Libra, or if you give me one of like this other kind of central bank coin, and if I kind of cryptographically verify that transaction, then I'll give you like 0.00 whatever ETH. And it's actually kind of like you have to actively try hard to stop those kinds of exchanges to be possible. And so the natural default is kind of for all of these systems to just have like lots of pathways for kind of interconnection between them, like whether the developers of the systems like it or not. And so, yeah, and I definitely think the future where the only kinds of currencies out there are kind of centralized and if nation-state issued ones would be quite an undesirable one. But I think I do believe in crypto just continuing to exist as at least as this kind of global outside option. But I think like with this competitive market existing and with crypto existing, and I think like there's reasons to be optimistic.
So we shouldn't be too worried about China because the surveillance state they have already is, extreme, and the notion of being able to issue a currency where you can track all of your citizens with that. I mean, that's sort of the dark side of crypto. That's not something that keeps you up at night.
I guess that's the sort of thing that would end up happening in centralized systems regardless. And so, I mean, yes, like kind of decentralized systems and centralized systems are kind of in competition in some sense. And if the centralized systems end up winning, then yes, you end up having all of these kinds of surveillance, and like there's a lot of scary things that can come out of that. But like, the important thing is just kind of making sure the decentralized alternatives exist, making sure that access to the decentralized alternatives exists and kind of as much redundant and kind of reasonably accessible access to the decentralized alternatives exists. And I think like even if not everyone ends up or even few people end up actually using the decentralized systems, I think kind of the fact that people have the option of moving to them will itself kind of put pressure on the centralized ones to kind of play nice.
All right. I'd love to turn up for questions in just a sec. There's a mic right there. We have about 15 minutes left. I've just got one more for you. If well, more if depends if the audience has any. But for me, I'd like to ask: to what degree are you following the American political scene right now? We've got sort of remarkable thing of Trump populism.
The American political scene. That's like almost as fun as like crypto Twitter, isn't it?
Okay,
No, it's like really fun. Like, just see like the Bloomberg campaign like released that really weird ad where you have like Trump, and then you have the gingerbread man, and then they have him going like lie, 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 lie. I don't know. It's like this is a weird system of governance, but I don't know. I don't know.
I don't disagree. But in a world between Bernie and Trump and Bloomberg, do you have a preference of those?
I mean, am I allowed to just like not comment? I mean, I don't know.
You can take a pass.
I'll take a pass on that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think the Yang Gang is cool. I'm kind of sad that it's gone for this round around. I don't know.
Great answer. Anyone out there have a question for Vitalik?
Hi. How do you feel about cryptocurrencies lobbying governments? And does the Ethereum Foundation spend money to lobby politicians in the U.S. or elsewhere?
I mean, lobbying is one of these things where there's this double-edged sword, and it's kind of impossible to separate kind of just legitimately providing information to politicians and regulators that like actually wants to hear the information versus kind of exercising outsized influence. And there's kind of this entire gray area in the middle. I mean, my opinion is that the foundation hasn't come close to doing anything unethical in that regard. And like I'd certainly like not supported doing anything like this, but we've definitely had a lot of friendly discussions with plenty of regulators of different kinds around the world, and I feel like in general it's kind of led to positive results, and people kind of appreciate that we're open and welcome and happy to talk. And I know if any regulators are listening, we definitely continue to be open and happy to talk. No.
Hey, I saw you earlier today. I just had a question. I know people talk a lot of the problems of decentralization, mainly scaling. But my question is, can you really solve the problems of decentralization with centralization? Because a lot of the solutions offered that I see to solve the problems around decentralization sound centralized or centralized.
So I think sharding scales, and I think sharding is not centralized. So that's one example. I mean, roll-ups scale to some extent, and roll-ups are not centralized. The entire kind of research that we've been doing around scaling the last 5 years is like precisely about how to kind of solve like the scalability triangle, like how to get decentralization, security, and scale at the same time. And I feel like we've made a lot of progress, and I'm happy with the solutions we've come up with.
As everyone knows, sustaining open source development is a wide-known issue, not just in our space, but open source in general. Carl from Optimus gave a presentation on MIVA, minor extractable value auctions. I was just wondering what your favorite approach in the space was for maybe securing developer funds, and whether it's... Go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess I'll focus, like in general, the public goods problem is split up into two problems. Like one is how you capture the value that you'll use to fund things, and the other is how you decide how to fund things. And it sounds like the question is about the first one, like I'll focus on the first one. So I like minor extractable value auctions. In general, I like the idea of having kind of layer 2 protocols that kind of put a large portion of revenue that they get in various ways back into the Ethereum ecosystem. So minor extractable value auctions and rollups, I think, are cool. I think fees for kind of storage inside of execution environments was another option that I brought up. On the application layer, I think, like even things like revenue from like ENS, from like and ENS like things in kind of auctioning off names. Like if that becomes more than enough to support that project itself, then I think it would be nice if kind of some of that revenue could be directed to supporting public goods in the Ethereum ecosystem. I mean, the more extreme option is is always kind of like base layer in protocol funding. And that's what Zcash is going for. That's what kind of that proposal in Bitcoin Cash has been going for. And that always exists as an extreme option, but it's extreme because like it does compromise Ethereum's monetary neutrality to some extent. I mean, you can kind of split it into two categories. Like you could say, oh, we're going to direct a portion of transaction fees, but we're going to have a social contract that you can't kind of increase issuance itself. And that might kind of make people more at ease because like they know that there's a kind of natural limit to how much money can end up kind of redirected by whatever the mechanism is. But I mean, in general, I think the protocol layer approaches are more kind of last resorts just because they do kind of break more things, that more forms of kind of neutrality that people would want the Ethereum protocol to have. And it would be nice to see if we can make these layer 2 techniques work. Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Anne from Toronto. Good to see you. So my question is, after we disintermediate the banks and the governments and the corporations and all of the machines in our lives have their own self-sovereign ID and they are effectively self-sovereign entities within our own society, what is the role of human beings when we disintermediate ourselves?
I mean, I think the important thing, right, is that like in general, decentralization is not about necessarily disintermediation. It's about kind of de-choke pointing. Like, there's lots of intermediaries, right? So, like, for example, every single node in the Ethereum network is an intermediary. When I do a trade on Uniswap, every liquidity provider is an intermediary. When I send a transaction through an optimistic rollup, whenever I'll do that, get it done quickly, guys. The sequencer will be an intermediary. There's lots of kind of layers of intermediaries, but the fact that they're decentralized means that it's a kind of choke point. I mean, I guess like and you can make this kind of analogy from kind of electrical engineering, right? Like when you have kind of resistors in series, the resistance adds up, but when you have kind of resistors in parallel that kind of the electrons can kind of choose between, then the resistance goes down. So it gets that kind of thing, right? When you kind of at every kind of necessary layer of intermediation, if you just allow anyone to kind of participate as part of that, and so you create kind of just inherently this kind of competitive market of different options, then that's where the benefits come from. And I mean, ultimately, I think like we are creating systems that are inevitably going to kind of involve kind of aggregating input from humans. I mean, robots could help like to some extent, but ultimately, I mean, even the robots are the thing that they're doing is, at least for the foreseeable future, predicting humans. And so like even if it's kind of locally controlled by a robot, it's ultimately kind of from a kind of looking further back, controlled by whatever robot or whatever human the robot is hopelessly trying to predict. And like that's how things should be, right? These systems are there to benefit people, and so if you want to actually do that, then the behavior of the system should somehow kind of be a consequence of things that people kind of want and things that people feed into the system as a result of what they want. And I think that's the way that things are just going to continue being.
Great. I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Well, she just mentioned that we're talking about decentralizing everything. So I'm curious if you think there's anything that is either impossible or very unlikely to ever be decentralized.
I mean, in decentralizing like individual human brains after you upload them is going to be kind of hard. Like I don't know, like NPC overhead is a lot, and I mean, like I do worry that if the NPCs end up colluding, then like they could download a copy of you and then they can like torture it, and that would be not very nice. More near-term things. In general, things are harder to decentralize if they require kind of like very sophisticated and kind of high-effort subjective input. Like if you have sophisticated and subjective input, then like it's just too inefficient to have like many people kind of going through the same kind of thought process, and so it'll end up kind of converging on just being one, and that seems kind of relatively difficult to avoid. Also, I mean, I think as far as kind of governance mechanisms goes, I mean, I like decentralized ones, but I also think there's this interesting design space of governance mechanisms with kind of bounded decentralization. So where you have kind of individuals having decision-making power within some latitude, but then a more decentralized thing, like basically having control of a nuke, so they can just say like, you bye bye, you go entirely, and like we'll replace you with someone else. Yeah, and in general, like I think kind of the design space for kind of centralized and decentralized things to complement each other is one that where there's a lot of kind of really good solutions that could end up lying.
I have a question with the advancement of proof of staking and a lot of things taking that position. How do you feel like with the money and inflow, some entity or person just kind of taking up the proof of staking, buying up a supply, taking up spinning massive nodes or whatever the case may be for any like type of blockchain itself that, essentially one entity or person can kind of control a lot of the supply and the massive nodes of said blockchain, and how decentralized do you become or lose it because one entity controls so much in the nodes?
Yeah, so I've actually recently started to do a bit of research into what I call kind of 51% attack mitigation and 51% attack recovery. So this is basically like if there is an entity that controls like more than half of the chain and they do something bad, how can we kind of automatically detect that this happened, and how can we automatically kind of coordinate on what the recovery path is? And it turns out that there actually are ways to do this that are kind of based on kind of what I call 99% fault-tolerant consensus. It's this kind of branch of consensus research that Leslie Lamport kind of included in his paper back in 1982, but then nobody cares about for some reason. And you can kind of basically at least achieve agreement between online nodes about whether or not an attack happened and kind of how to recover from it. And so if you kind of combine that with kind of some level of reliance on the social layer, then you can come up with a system where like attacks actually don't cause that much damage, and so there isn't even that much benefit to kind of starting an attack. And so that's that's one possibility. I mean, otherwise, and aside from that, there's also the second line of defense, which is just kind of making sure that the number of validators participating in staking is large enough that it's like really, really, really expensive and difficult to actually get more than anyone else put together. And part of that is just democratizing staking, making it easier to stake, which we've been doing a lot of, making it cheaper to stake. So it's a combination of those two approaches.
So it sounds like you're more confident in staking and proof of stake than ever before.
I think so.
Great. Just like to wrap up with a more general question of what ideas are really exciting you lately? Is there something you've read lately that really, has got Vitalik excited?
I mean, a lot of things. I mean, I think these 51% attack recovery things are exciting. And I think quadratic funding is exciting. I think the progress that was made in zero-knowledge proofs in the last year is like amazingly exciting. A lot of also just kind of things that I'm seeing in the ecosystem. So like the fact it feels like kind of the crypto space as a whole is taking these kind of public goods funding challenges within the ecosystem much more seriously, and instead of being open to different approaches to meeting them. So you have the Zcash extension of the founders, the Dev reward. You have the Bitcoin Cash kind of proposal, and you have kind of the quadratic funding and Gitcoin grants happening in the Ethereum ecosystem, and all these discussions around MEV auctions. So like the fact that all of those discussions are happening is definitely something that kind of makes me happy, and just generally also the fact that kind of it feels like the Ethereum community kind of has more and more of a kind of coherent philosophy around these things, and it's not just kind of jumping around and trying to do everything. Like there's more and more kind of coherent ideas about what kind of world these things are all trying to create. And I mean, there's still like a lot of internal diversity within the Ethereum community, and I think kind of internal diversity of this is the Ethereum community's greatest strength. But you can kind of have both at the same time.
Let's actually wrap up on this. Let's speak right to the Ethereum community. They're here before you. What is the health of the community right now? How are you feeling about it compared to other times?
I feel like it's the healthiest it's ever been. I mean, And like you could say that like on the one hand, you know, the number like if we did a conference, the number of people that would show up to the conference is lower now than it was like at the top of the bubble in January 2018. But at the same time, like the people that join in during the bubbles, like some of them stay for the long term, but a huge number of them don't stay for the long term, and they're like you need time to kind of understand who's there because like this is a temporary thing, and it's cool for like a short amount of time versus people who kind of really are there because they believe in the ideas and the values for the long term. And I feel like, I don't know, the people that have stuck around in the last 2 years are people that have stuck around for the right reasons, and the community has kind of grown kind of in the right directions. So I think that's been a very kind of positive thing. Also, just the growth of kind of different projects trying to do things kind of independently of the Ethereum Foundation is a really kind of huge and positive sign. Like I've mentioned, I think the Ethereum community is way more self-sustaining than it was 2 years ago, and all of those things make me really happy.
It's great. Okay, well, let's give it up for Vitalik. Thanks, everyone.